Jenna Baker never considered herself the confrontational type. In fact, she went out of her way to avoid drama, declining committee roles at the college where she taught visual design, choosing quiet neighborhoods over bustling complexes, and rarely, if ever, getting involved in neighborly disputes. Life was already noisy enough, especially for someone whose day-to-day revolved around color theory, layout grids, and trying to convince 18-year-olds that typography mattered. But when her niece asked if her 8-year-old daughter Lily could stay for a week over the summer, Jenna said yes without hesitation. It wasn't just about helping her sister. It was about the simple joy she felt when Lily was around. The girl had this instinctive creativity, the kind that didn't ask permission before expressing itself. And Jenna saw in her the kind of untethered spark she herself had once had before life. Work and bills demanded order. Their routine was simple: breakfast in the small garden, a trip to the park every other day, afternoons spent baking, gluing feathers to cardboard masks, and lying on the grass reading children's versions of Greek myths. But what Lily loved most was drawing outside, on the sidewalk, on the concrete path leading up to Jenna's door, and once, even across the stepping stones lining the driveway. She used chalk with the intensity of someone who didn't understand self-consciousness yet. Her lines were wild, her colors bright and fearless. On Saturday morning, after finishing her cereal, Lily asked if she could do something big. Jenna smiled and said, "Big is good. Just don't forget the shadows this time." The idea was simple enough. Lily had been sketching a woman she called Sun Lady in her notebook, inspired, Jenna suspected, by one of the vintage postcards Jenna had pinned above her workspace. The woman was elegant, wearing oversized sunglasses, a flowy yellow dress, and surrounded by butterflies. It wasn't a caricature, and it wasn't particularly realistic either. It was more of a luminous presence than a portrait, joyful and soft. Lily sat up on the curb, and over the next 2 hours, created a 10-foot-long piece in pastel yellows, oranges, and a vibrant blue that somehow made the entire concrete slab feel warmer than the morning sun already had. Jenna sat nearby on a folding chair with her sketch pad, sipping iced tea and letting the hum of sprinklers and birdsong carry her thoughts away from deadlines and grading rubrics. She didn't notice the woman standing across the street until the silence became dense. Karen, short, tightly wound, always wearing either beige or navy, had the posture of someone who spent most of her energy trying to make things fit into neat lines. She lived 2 doors down, and though Jenna had waved at her several times in passing, she'd never received more than a nod. Today, however, Karen stood with both arms folded across her chest, jaw tight, and eyes fixed on the chalk drawing like it was a public health hazard. Jenna stood up slowly and offered a polite, "Good morning." Karen didn't answer. Instead, she marched across the street with a kind of mechanical purpose, stopping just short of the sidewalk. Her voice, when it came, was brittle. "Is that supposed to be me?" Lily, who had just started outlining the final butterfly, looked up, confused. Jenna blinked, caught off guard by the tone. "I'm sorry?" Karen jabbed a finger at the chalk. "The woman, the sunglasses, the yellow dress. That's me, isn't it?" Jenna glanced down at the drawing. It did bear a passing resemblance to Karen, sure, but only in the most general sense. Blonde bob, big glasses, but this wasn't a portrait. It was a child's fantasy. It's a character Lily's been drawing all week. She calls her the Sun Lady. It's not meant to be anyone in particular. Karen's lips tightened. "Don't patronize me. You think I don't see what's going on here? You're trying to make fun of me." Publicly, with a drawing. It's humiliating. Jenna stared at her, incredulous. "Karen, it's sidewalk chalk. She's 8. She's not mocking anyone. She's drawing what makes her happy." Karen turned her gaze on Lily, who shrank back slightly under the weight of her stare. "Well, little girls need to learn there are rules. You don't draw people without permission, especially not in neighborhoods like this. Jenna stepped forward, putting herself between them. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to my niece like that." Karen's face flushed. "Maybe you don't know how things work around here. Maybe you think this is some kind of bohemian playground, but some of us take pride in where we live. And I won't have my likeness, or anything close to it, defaced and paraded around like a joke." She turned abruptly and marched back across the street, muttering something about documenting this and having it removed. Jenna watched her go, heart hammering with a strange combination of confusion and anger. She looked down at Lily, who was now sitting on the curb, legs pulled up to her chest. "Am I in trouble?" the girl asked quietly. Jenna crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong." But the tension lingered, like a film of dust that wouldn't blow away. Jenna didn't sleep well that night. She kept replaying the scene, Karen's fury, her certainty that she was being attacked, and most of all, that phrase, "neighborhoods like this." What did that mean? Jenna had moved here less than a year ago, drawn by the quiet streets and low rent. It was an older neighborhood, mostly retired couples and a few young families. No drama, no pettiness, until now. By Monday, the chalk drawing was gone. Jenna hadn't washed it off, and Lily certainly hadn't. Someone had poured water over the sidewalk, unevenly, in long streaks like from a garden hose. The butterflies were smudged into pale ghost shapes, and the woman in yellow had been all but erased. Jenna noticed this on her way out to the mailbox and froze. Inside was a folded note, typed in large font and printed on cheap paper. No name, no address. Just this: "Art that hurts is not art. We'll be watching." She read it twice, fingers tightening around the page. There was no signature, no return address, nothing to trace. Jenna brought the note inside, laid it on the table, and sat down across from it like it was some sort of cursed object. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. Someone had deliberately destroyed a child's artwork and left an anonymous warning. And that someone was almost certainly Karen, or someone encouraged by her. Jenna knew she had a decision to make. She could brush this off, let it go, protect Lily from further conflict, and just avoid the neighbor altogether. Or she could start pushing back, not with yelling or confrontation, but with something Karen clearly wasn't prepared for: clarity, documentation, and unapologetic truth. She wasn't going to turn this into a performance, and she wasn't about to raise her voice. But she also wasn't going to let someone frighten a child for doing what children do best: create without fear. That morning, she took photos of the erased sidewalk and the note. Not because she intended to go to the police just yet, but because she knew better than to leave herself defenseless if things escalated. And something deep in her gut told her they would. Jenna wasn't someone who overreacted. Her instinct had always been to de-escalate, to observe, to allow people their space, even when they were difficult. But something about the tone of that note, the self-righteousness hiding behind the passive phrasing, the cowardice of anonymity, unsettled her far more than she cared to admit. She didn't mention it to Lily at first. The girl had moved on in the way children often do, already drawing new scenes on paper indoors, asking Jenna for different shades of orange and chatting about a dream she'd had involving a cat who could teleport. But Jenna felt a quiet tightness building in her chest every time she passed the edge of the sidewalk where the erased mural had once been, a tension that only grew when she noticed that the note was not an isolated incident. The following afternoon, a message appeared in her inbox from her rental management company. It was bland in tone but firm in implication. A neighbor had submitted a community concern regarding misuse of the front yard and sidewalk area for inappropriate visual displays. The management company was requesting that Jenna refrain from activities that may be perceived as disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic or in violation of community courtesy. There was no specific accusation, no name attached, and nothing referencing the chalk directly, but it was clear what it was about. Jenna stared at the email in disbelief, rereading the phrasing that turned a child's drawing into an inappropriate visual display. It was the language of bureaucracy pretending to be neutral, while weaponizing the complaint of someone who wanted to intimidate her from behind a curtain. She called the office, calmly asking for clarification. The representative, polite but detached, explained that the company had to take all neighborhood concerns seriously. Jenna asked if they could specify what policy she had violated. There was silence on the other end, followed by the admission that the lease didn't prohibit chalk drawings or supervised outdoor activities. But, the voice added with bureaucratic caution, we're just asking for mindfulness, to maintain harmony with the community. Harmony, Jenna thought bitterly, had become a synonym for silence. And in this case, it was silence demanded not from the one causing harm, but from the person inconveniencing someone else's inflated sense of control. Later that day, she walked outside to retrieve the mail, only to find that her mailbox had been tampered with. The lid was slightly bent, as if someone had tried to force it open. Inside, along with the usual flyers and bills, was another note, not typed this time, but handwritten in large, all-capital letters. Kids should be taught respect, not to mock people. You think it's cute. It's not. There were no drawings or doodles, no name, no attempt to sound reasonable. The letters were angular, rushed, almost scratched onto the paper. Jenna didn't need to guess who it came from. And while a part of her still wanted to believe it was an isolated person lashing out in a moment of insecurity, the escalation was undeniable. She sat on the couch that evening after putting Lily to bed, staring at the note on the kitchen counter. Her impulse was still to handle this privately, to avoid dragging things into unnecessary drama. But she was no longer sure this could be brushed aside. There was a difference between a cranky neighbor making a passive-aggressive comment and someone actively targeting a child with veiled threats and physical actions. She started documenting every detail. She scanned both notes into a folder, took photos of the mailbox and its dent, and started a journal where she logged each incident, including dates, times, and what she saw or heard. It wasn't about preparing for a lawsuit or filing charges. It was about not being caught unprepared if this turned into something worse. The next morning, she was out in the front yard when she noticed the woman across the street watching her from behind a curtain. Karen didn't make a move, didn't wave or approach, just stood there, visible enough to be noticed, invisible enough to deny she was doing anything. Jenna met her gaze for a moment, then calmly returned to sweeping the front step. She didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but the next event came not from Karen directly, but from one of the other neighbors. Mrs. Campbell, an older woman who lived next door, knocked on Jenna's door just before lunch. She held a container of cookies and wore her usual thick cardigan despite the heat. Her face was pinched with discomfort, as though what she was about to say didn't sit well with her. Jenna invited her in, and they sat at the kitchen table while Lily played in the living room. "I just wanted to say," Mrs. Campbell began, fiddling with the edge of a napkin, "that some people are talking. They think, maybe you're trying to stir things up, that you're provoking Karen on purpose." Jenna blinked. "By letting a child draw with chalk on the sidewalk." Mrs. Campbell looked apologetic. "You know how it is. People talk. They think that mural looked too much like her. And now with all this tension, they think you're not helping things by, well, some of them say it's intentional, that maybe you're trying to embarrass her." Jenna exhaled slowly. She didn't raise her voice. "Lily is 8. She drew what she called a sun lady. There was no intention behind it, and even if there had been, does that justify everything that's followed?" Mrs. Campbell didn't answer. She just patted Jenna's hand and said something about hoping things would settle down soon. But Jenna could feel the shift. The neighborhood wasn't neutral anymore. There was pressure, not overt, but atmospheric. A collective discomfort that someone, one person, had weaponized, and others were too passive to resist. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Jenna sat outside on the porch, letting the air cool her thoughts. She watched the shadows crawl slowly across the front yard and thought about all the ways she could respond. She could confront Karen directly, though that would likely end in another accusation. She could appeal to the property manager, but they had made it clear they were more interested in keeping complaints quiet than finding the truth. Or she could retreat, keep Lily inside, stop the drawings, let this whole thing blow over. That last option stuck in her throat like a splinter. To do nothing would be to tell Lily that her joy was dangerous, that art was a risk, and expression was a problem if it made the wrong people uncomfortable. And that was a lesson Jenna would never teach. She went back inside and opened her laptop. She didn't search for confrontation or legal retaliation. She searched for something else. Local mural artists, community programs, and city arts projects that encouraged public engagement through legal, permitted outdoor art. She made calls, left emails, and asked questions, not about revenge but about options. If they wanted to accuse her of disrespecting the neighborhood's visual integrity, she would show them what real visual presence looked like, and she would do it with support, legally and clearly, with full transparency. Because if people were going to be watching her, she might as well give them something worth seeing. Jenna had always believed that when people saw something clearly, when the truth was laid out plainly and without malice, most would respond with reason. That belief had carried her through countless classroom disagreements, design critiques, faculty politics, and even family tension. But in the days that followed her research into legal mural work, it became increasingly clear that reason was not the force shaping the events unfolding around her. It started subtly at first. A cold shift in the way neighbors who used to greet her now barely offered a nod. A door closed quickly when she walked by, or long stares from across the street that lingered just a little too long to be polite. Even the kids who had once stopped to admire Lily's chalk drawings were now steered gently but firmly away by their parents with vague excuses about being in a hurry or needing to stay clean for dinner. Then came the trash incident. Jenna stepped out one morning to find both her recycling and garbage bins overturned at the edge of the driveway, their contents scattered in a deliberate arc that suggested more than a gust of wind. Banana peels, torn paper, coffee grounds, all strewn across the strip of sidewalk where Lily had drawn just a week prior. At first, Jenna thought maybe it was an animal, but the way the bags had been ripped, not torn but slashed cleanly, told another story. She picked up the mess silently, wearing gloves, her jaw set. There was no one outside, no witnesses. Just the same silence that had begun to thicken like humidity in the neighborhood. She took photos, time-stamped them, and added them to her folder. But it wasn't until she found Lily's drawing pad, which they had accidentally left on the porch overnight, soaked through and torn apart, pages stuck together in a pulpy mess, that Jenna's restraint started to fray. This wasn't passive disapproval anymore, this was a campaign. A quiet, deniable, plausible campaign of pressure, designed not to break her quickly but to wear her down, to make her second-guess herself, to question whether defending her niece's innocent artwork was worth the persistent stress and escalating hostility. That night, she finally called her sister, not because she wanted to worry her, but because she couldn't keep shielding Lily from something that was no longer just neighborhood friction. She explained what had been happening, choosing her words carefully, omitting the worst of the threats but not minimizing the pattern. Her sister was alarmed, of course, but trusted Jenna's judgment. "Should I come get her early?" she asked, and Jenna hesitated. Every instinct in her said yes, that removing Lily was the safest, easiest path forward. But the other part of her, the part that had taken weeks to resurface after years of conflict avoidance, said no. They hadn't done anything wrong. Lily was safe inside, always watched over. And sending her away now would only teach her that the world belonged to the loudest, the most fearful, the most controlling. "No," Jenna said quietly. "Not yet, but I'll keep you updated." And she would. She was keeping logs, photos, emails. She wasn't playing this blindly. She even contacted a community advocacy group she had found online during her search for mural programs. They weren't lawyers, but they offered support in situations involving neighborhood harassment and community pressure. The woman she spoke to, Renee, was calm and incredibly precise. "You're documenting. Good. Don't stop. Don't engage. If anything becomes overt, if someone steps onto your property again, you call us and you file immediately. Don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. You don't need to explain yourself. You just need to be clear." That conversation gave Jenna a small sliver of air to breathe. Not relief, but reinforcement. Confirmation that she wasn't imagining things, that her decisions were valid, and that there were pathways to follow that didn't require her to unravel emotionally in order to respond. But the neighborhood itself didn't wait for her to find balance. A day later, while Jenna was returning from the grocery store, she saw Karen standing on her driveway with another woman, someone Jenna recognized vaguely from 2 streets over. They were pointing at her house, then at the sidewalk, speaking in hushed tones. When Karen noticed her watching, she didn't look away. Instead, she smiled, not warmly, but with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes they're already won. Jenna felt a flicker of something sharp in her stomach, not quite fear, but a sense of inevitability. She didn't wave, she didn't nod, she just walked inside and closed the door behind her. That evening, she received another email from the property manager. This time, it was more direct. A second complaint had been filed and the tone had shifted from gentle warning to conditional threat. "Further disregard for community cohesion," the letter read, "may result in the review of your tenancy agreement." No detail, no incident report, just vague phrasing that echoed like something lifted from a homeowner's manual on passive aggression. Jenna read it 3 times, then called the number listed on the email. The woman who answered was new, unfamiliar, clearly reading from a script. Jenna asked to speak to someone who had processed the complaint. She was told they weren't available. When she pushed for more specifics, what violation, what date, who had filed the report, she was met with polite stonewalling. "We are unable to release the identity of the complainant." Of course not. That was the brilliance of the system. Anonymous complaints, unverified accusations, and vague enforcement, all of it designed to make the accused feel like they were the ones being unreasonable just by asking for clarity. That night, Jenna sat on her porch long after Lily had gone to bed, drinking tea that had long gone cold. She thought about moving. She thought about breaking the lease, calling her sister, packing up and finding a place in a city where chalk drawings weren't viewed as a threat. But that thought made her angrier than anything Karen had done. Why should they have to leave? Why should the narrative shift to her being the problem? Because she wouldn't silence a child for the comfort of one woman's paranoia? She stood up, walked inside, and pulled out her sketch pad. She hadn't drawn for herself in weeks. Teaching had drained her creative energy, and the tension of the last days had buried what little was left. But now, her pencil moved without hesitation. She started sketching the mural. Not the one Lily had drawn, but a version of it reimagined. Larger, bolder, with layers that weren't present in the original. The woman in yellow was still there, but now she stood in motion, surrounded not only by butterflies, but by shapes that resembled shields, vines, and flame. And her face, still obscured, was turned toward the wall, not away from it, as if facing down something unseen. Jenna didn't know what it meant yet. But as her pencil moved, she felt something loosen inside her, a tension breaking, not into collapse, but into form. She wasn't going to fight fire with fire, but she was going to build something that couldn't be erased with a hose or a note. Something that would speak louder than 100 whispers behind curtains. Something no one could mistake for permission. She didn't need their approval. She just needed the right wall. Jenna had never painted a wall before. She'd taught color theory, sketched compositions, guided students through mural projects in controlled classroom settings, but never committed her own hand to something so public and immovable. Yet, by the middle of the week, she had already contacted 2 local artists who had worked with community engagement programs. One of them, Matteo, agreed to meet her at a nearby coffee shop. He was younger than she expected, with a calm, self-assured way of speaking and a portfolio filled with vibrant, arresting work that transformed neglected spaces into something both visceral and human. When she explained her idea, without naming Karen, without dramatizing the events, he listened without interruption. Then he simply nodded and said, "If the wall is legal and the space is yours to use, then I don't see why not." Jenna hesitated. "It's not mine, but I think I can use it legally." She explained that the side of Karen's garage faced a strip of alley that wasn't privately owned. It was technically municipal property, a neglected passage between 2 rows of homes where city crews occasionally mowed weeds but otherwise ignored. Matteo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. So, if it's municipal, and she hasn't claimed it with a permit, that wall might not be off limits. Jenna had already begun the process of confirming the status through the local arts outreach office. She'd submitted a request to clarify whether the city allowed temporary murals in shared public-facing spaces, and whether permits were needed if the structure was not under private jurisdiction, but merely adjacent to it. It was a bureaucratic knot, but she didn't mind waiting. She wanted this to be done properly, so there would be no ammunition against her when the time came. Meanwhile, the pressure around her continued to pulse like a low, unrelenting hum. One morning, she found a dead plant placed at the edge of her front step. Its soil spilled, the plastic pot cracked. Another day, she discovered that her house had been photographed. She knew this not because someone had confessed, but because a neighbor's son, a boy no older than 10, had shyly told Lily, "My mom says your grandma's going to be on the news for drawing mean stuff." It wasn't the boy's fault. He repeated what he heard, like children always do. But the fact that Jenna's quiet defense of her niece had morphed, in the minds of some, into public menace, it chilled her. When the city finally responded, the answer was unexpected but strangely liberating. The alley space was indeed public access. While no one was allowed to paint city-owned buildings or private property, any non-commercial artwork placed on private structures adjacent to public land was not in violation of local ordinance if the mural did not contain offensive content, promote violence, or obscure any signage. In other words, if no one owned the wall's visual rights, and if she could get an artist to initiate it as part of an arts awareness project, then it could proceed without permission from the homeowner, provided the physical surface was accessible from public ground. Jenna stared at the email, rereading the legal phrasing. This wasn't a loophole, it was a gray area. But it was an area nonetheless, and if she stayed within it, she would be untouchable in the ways that mattered most. She immediately contacted Matteo, forwarding him the city's note. "You sure you want to do it?" he asked on the phone. "Because once it's up, even if it's legal, it's not quiet." Jenna didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." The next 2 days were spent gathering materials. Matteo sketched out a scaled version of the mural, adjusting it to fit the rough texture of the concrete garage. It would be done in layers, with underpainting, washes, and a final coat of weather-resistant sealant. Jenna covered the cost of the paint and offered a small commission. He refused it. "I've wanted to paint a challenge piece for months. This is a story worth telling." They chose the night before the weekend to begin. Matteo and another artist friend of his arrived just before dusk with a ladder, tarps, and crates of color. Jenna stayed nearby, Not overseeing, not controlling, just quietly supporting. Lily, unaware of the specifics, had been sent to her aunt's for 2 nights. Jenna hadn't lied, just told her that the artists were doing something special with one of her drawings and it needed to be a surprise. The work unfolded slowly. Underpainting first. A soft gold, with hints of blue beneath the figure's outline. Then, with steady, purposeful strokes, the Sun Lady emerged again, this time not from chalk or notebook pages, but in sweeping arcs of brush and shadow. She was taller now, standing upright rather than posed, her dress fluttering as if caught in a wind. Instead of just butterflies, this version carried shapes that hinted at memory, swirling forms resembling pressed flowers, broken glasses, a blurred profile in the background. Faint, but present. The mural didn't accuse. It didn't mimic. It transcended. It told a story of transformation, of fragility held in defiance, of identity forged through observation rather than force. By morning, it was complete. No tag, no signature. Just a single stenciled phrase at the bottom corner, subtle and lowercase. This was never about you. Jenna hadn't come up with the phrase, but she agreed to it instantly when Matteo suggested it. It spoke directly to the idea of imposed ownership, the belief that someone could hijack art simply because it echoed something inside them. Predictably, it didn't go unnoticed. Karen saw it first, of course. She emerged from her front door as if summoned, staring across the narrow street, then cutting sharply through her yard to the alley. Jenna watched from her own porch, silent as Karen stood before the mural, her back stiff, one hand clenched in disbelief. She didn't speak. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She simply turned and walked back to her house, but not before yanking her phone from her pocket and taking several photos. By noon, 2 other neighbors had passed by the alley, pausing longer than necessary. One of them, a man Jenna didn't know by name but had seen trimming hedges obsessively 2 houses over, took his time, folded his arms, then walked away, shaking his head. Another, a teenage girl with earbuds in, took a selfie with the mural behind her and smiled. Later that day, Matteo called. "Brace yourself," he said. "We made a ripple." Jenna didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because what she saw, etched in sun-yellow paint and layered in human intent, was not a weapon. It wasn't retaliation. It was a boundary. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was standing on the right side of it. Jenna had known, even before the last brushstroke dried, that the mural would not pass quietly. It was too bold, too permanent, too public a gesture for a neighborhood where disputes were expected to remain in glances and passive-aggressive notes. She hadn't painted it herself, but she'd orchestrated its existence. She had placed beauty precisely where someone had tried to impose fear. That act, no matter how technically legal, no matter how artistically grounded, was always going to provoke something. What she hadn't fully predicted was the nature of the response. Not swift, not explosive, but slow and suffocating, like smoke filling a room through the smallest cracks. It started 2 days later when she received a notice from the city's Public Works Department informing her that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized alteration of a visible residential structure. The language was vague, and when she called for clarification, the voice on the other end was polite but disinterested. They confirmed that an investigation would be conducted to determine whether the mural was in violation of any municipal codes, and if so, whether removal would be necessary. Jenna explained again. The public access alley, the city correspondence she'd received weeks prior, and the permit-free conditions for non-commercial artwork. The clerk took notes, promised to forward the details, and offered no opinion. That same afternoon, she noticed that a small orange flag had been staked near the alley, likely by a city worker marking the property line. Within 24 hours, more flags appeared in front of Karen's garage, along the fence line, and in front of Jenna's own rental. Whether this was normal procedural follow-up or something more targeted was unclear, but the message was implicit. You've made your point. Now the system will make its own. Jenna didn't panic. She documented everything. Photos of the flags, screen captures of her permit communications, and a printed timeline of her steps. But as she sat at her kitchen table that night, surrounded by folders, her hands began to tremble. Not from fear, but from the exhausting certainty that reason alone wouldn't be enough. This was no longer about legality or policy. It was about territory, emotional, visual, and psychological, and the fact that Jenna had dared to carve out space, however indirectly, on someone else's perceived turf. A week passed with no formal escalation, and Jenna thought perhaps the tension was beginning to recede. But then, without warning, things turned mean. One morning, she found the spray paint on her trash bins. Thick, red, angry strokes, not tags, not symbols, just the word liar scrawled across both containers. The letters were clumsy, uneven, but unmistakable. She stared at the word for a long time before touching it. The paint was still slightly tacky. Whoever had done it had come in the early hours, likely while she and Lily were sleeping. Jenna took pictures, filed another report, and scrubbed the bins clean with solvent and steel wool. The next day, she installed 2 more motion-activated cameras, one facing the alley, one angled toward the side yard. She didn't post about it. She didn't mention it to her neighbors. She simply recorded, documented, and moved forward. But what rattled her more than the vandalism was the anonymous voicemail she received 2 nights later. It came in just after midnight, a number she didn't recognize. She played it in the morning, standing barefoot in the kitchen. A woman's voice, low, slightly distorted as if speaking through fabric, said only this: "We all see what you're doing. It won't last." That was it. No name. No direct threat. But the tone, flat, precise, intimate, was unmistakably a warning. Jenna saved the voicemail and forwarded it to both the police and the community advocate Renee, who advised her to begin compiling not just incident reports but direct witness statements if possible. The mural, meanwhile, became a minor phenomenon. Photos of it appeared on a local art blog. A college student tagged it in a social media post that gained modest traction, referring to it as the quiet wall. Within a few days, more people than ever were walking through the alley. Not crowds, not tourists, but curious passers-by. Quiet. Neighbors, even an older man with a camera who spent 15 minutes just photographing shadows across the painted surface. Most of them didn't knock on her door or speak. They simply observed. Jenna watched them from her kitchen window, a strange mix of pride and dread settling in her chest. She hadn't sought attention, but now that it had arrived, it created a pressure she couldn't shake. Then came the formal letter. It arrived by certified mail, addressed from a private law firm representing concerned homeowners in the immediate residential district. The letter accused her of defacing property, inciting tension, and creating an environment that was increasingly hostile to respectful cohabitation. It demanded the immediate removal of the mural or risked further legal remedies. There was no direct citation of city code, no evidence of damage or trespass, just vague language and the threat of escalation. Jenna took the letter to a legal clinic recommended by the advocacy group. The volunteer lawyer, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, read it, chuckled, and said, "They're trying to scare you into backing down. It's pressure without teeth, but you should prepare anyway." She advised Jenna to respond formally, not with an apology, but with a statement of record, a document that reasserted her legal right to remain, to host public art, and to document every threat or action taken against her. Jenna complied, drafting a response that was measured, professional, and firm. She included copies of the city's previous communication and a short explanation of the mural's purpose as a community expression. She mailed it to the firm and sent a copy to the city's public works office. She didn't expect it to end things, but it was her line in the sand. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed, the girl looked at her and asked, "Why don't we draw outside anymore?" Jenna paused, then said, "Because sometimes grown-ups forget what it's like to make something without fear." Lily was quiet for a moment. "But I'm not scared." Jenna kissed her forehead. "Then I won't be either." But fear wasn't the same as caution, and the next morning proved why. Sometime before dawn, someone had left a dead bird on her front step. Not placed gently, thrown. Its wing was broken, feathers scattered like ash. There was no note, just the silence of escalation, the shift from words to objects, from symbolism to intimidation. Jenna didn't touch it. She photographed it, called the police, and filed another report. The responding officer was quiet, professional, and grim. "We can't prove who did this," he said, "but it's not random." "Be careful." She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply swept the porch, wiped the blood, and replaced the front light with a brighter bulb. A few nights later, the camera facing the alley captured something that changed the trajectory of everything. At 3:17 a.m., a figure approached the mural with a long object, maybe a broom, maybe a mop handle, and began poking and scraping at the paint. They worked quickly, glancing around, careful not to stand still. The footage wasn't perfect, but the build, the walk, the silhouette, it was unmistakably Karen, or someone from her household. The shape of the dog leash in one hand sealed it. Jenna saved the footage, copied it to 2 separate drives, and sent it to the advocacy group. Renee responded within minutes. "This is enough to file an injunction. We'll connect you with someone." Jenna didn't rush to press charges. She wanted clarity, not retribution. But the next morning, she filed a report with the police and submitted a formal request to the city to protect the mural as a community interest display under their temporary art statute. It was a long shot, but if granted, it would give the mural provisional status and protection for at least 6 months. The application required public input, so she drafted a letter explaining the mural's origin, the harassment leading to it, and her hope that it might stand not as a protest but as a quiet assertion of presence. She shared the letter with a few neighbors who had remained kind, asking if they'd be willing to sign. To her surprise, several did, softly, cautiously, but without hesitation. One woman, who'd never spoken more than 2 words to Jenna before, whispered, "She's been scaring people for years. You just didn't know yet." Jenna mailed the petition with a trembling hand, not because she feared the outcome, but because she finally understood the scale of what she'd stepped into. This wasn't about chalk or paint. It was about the invisible systems that kept people small, and for the first time, someone had broken through the silence. Not with fire, not with shouting, but with a figure in a yellow dress and a mural that simply refused to go away. By the time the mural was officially granted temporary protective status by the city, Jenna could feel the strain of the last few weeks like a permanent bruise beneath her skin. She hadn't expected victory. She hadn't even truly expected fairness. But the official letter, embossed with the city seal and delivered by mail with bureaucratic neutrality, held a weight she hadn't realized she needed. The mural would stand for at least 6 months, reviewed afterward only if more than 3 formal complaints were substantiated. And considering the absurdity of the opposition thus far, Jenna suspected most would fall apart under scrutiny. It was, in many ways, a fragile win, one that didn't guarantee peace or goodwill, but it was a structural line of defense, and that meant something. She placed the letter in a clear sleeve and tucked it inside her documentation binder. By now, the folder was thick with photographs, copies of emails, police reports, complaint letters, her own detailed logs of incidents with timestamps, camera captures, and every strange, unsettling note that had landed in her mailbox. It was an archive of pressure, a catalog of escalation, and yet she flipped through it, not with fear, but with something colder: resolve. There was no more ambiguity. No room left for doubt or hesitation. The mural was no longer just a message. It was a shield. And the war, quiet as it had been, was very real. The neighborhood remained uneasy. People still whispered. Karen no longer tried to hide her disdain. She walked her dog past Jenna's house every morning with exaggerated calm, occasionally stopping just long enough to let the animal piss on Jenna's edge of the sidewalk. It was juvenile, absurd, but pointed. On more than one occasion, she made a show of photographing the mural from different angles, as if trying to catch it in some act of violation. Jenna ignored her. That was, perhaps, the most infuriating part for Karen, how Jenna refused to meet her at her level. She wasn't escalating. She was enduring, and endurance, when public and quiet, is often the most dangerous form of resistance. One evening, Jenna returned home from work to find a note pinned under a stone on her back porch. It hadn't been left in the mailbox, which meant someone had stepped onto the property again. The handwriting was tight and shaky. The message read, "You should be ashamed of what you're teaching that child. Women who behave like this end up alone." Jenna read it once, then again. Then she calmly walked to her fire pit, struck a match, and burned it. She didn't bother to log it. It was no longer about collecting evidence. It was about reclaiming her space in real time. Still, it wasn't until the evening of the neighborhood's monthly street cleanup that things finally ruptured. It was an event Jenna had never attended before, an informal gathering where residents picked up trash, pruned overgrown shrubs along the sidewalks, and briefly pretended that their proximity made them a community. She hadn't planned to go this time either, but after two neighbors unexpectedly thanked her for sticking it out, she decided to show up, if only to confirm that she wasn't entirely isolated. Lily was with her sister for the weekend, which left her the freedom to move through the gathering without distraction. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. Jenna wore gloves, picked up wrappers and bits of debris along the curb, and made quiet small talk with a woman named Patrice who worked at the post office. People weren't warm, but they weren't openly hostile either. It was a kind of tolerable politeness, the kind that exists not out of kindness but the social inertia of not wanting to seem uncivil. Then Karen arrived. She strode into the street holding a rake, wearing her usual pressed khakis and a dark blue windbreaker zipped to her chin. She didn't look at Jenna, but her presence was as sharp as ever, her movements brisk, her eyes scanning everyone like they might be part of a private game she alone was winning. No one spoke to her, not even the ones who had once sided with her. That silence should have warned Jenna, but she mistook it for disinterest. She didn't see it for what it was, an inhale before the scream. Karen struck quickly. She waited until Jenna had her back turned, bent over picking up a crushed can from beneath a hedge. Then, in one calculated motion, Karen marched across the street toward the alley, lifted a full bucket of diluted paint, where it had come from, Jenna would never know, and threw it against the mural. The sound was soft, like a low splash, but the effect was immediate. A gray, viscous mess poured down the woman in yellow, streaking through her outline like blood in water. Jenna turned just in time to see the tail end of the act. Karen's arm extended, the bucket bouncing once as it hit the pavement. For a second, no one moved. Not Karen. Not Jenna. Not the 6 or 7 people standing within view. It was as if time itself had paused in disbelief. Then Jenna stepped forward. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She simply took out her phone, pressed the side button, and started recording. Karen turned toward her, eyes wide but unapologetic. "You think you can paint whatever you want and not face consequences?" she snapped. "This is a neighborhood, not a canvas. You want to provoke people? Well, now you get a response." Jenna didn't respond. She didn't need to. The mural was damaged, but not destroyed. The protective coating had helped. The paint had streaked but hadn't seeped fully into the wall. What mattered more was that Karen had done it publicly. in front of witnesses, with premeditation. Jenna slowly panned her phone toward the wall, then back to Karen. Several neighbors had taken out their phones, too. One of them, quietly, whispered, "I saw her come in with that bucket. She brought it from her garage." It was over in less than 2 minutes. Jenna didn't press charges that night. She didn't shout or demand apologies. She simply submitted the footage to the police, filed a formal complaint, and attached it to her growing case file. The mural could be repaired. The paint would be removed. But what mattered most was this. The silence had been broken by the aggressor herself. Karen had unmasked her own malice, and everyone had seen it. The following morning, Jenna received 3 letters of support. One from the city's art liaison thanking her for her patience, one from a neighbor offering to help pay for repairs, and one, handwritten without signature, from someone who wrote, "I've lived across from her for 12 years. Thank you for doing what the rest of us never dared." The mural wasn't just surviving now, it was being guarded. And Jenna, for the first time in months, felt something close to peace. Not because she had won, but because she had stood. In the days that followed the incident, a peculiar stillness settled over the neighborhood. Not a silence born of fear, but the quieter hum of tension that had finally collapsed under its own weight. The mural, though vandalized, remained intact thanks to the protective coating and the quick intervention of 2 volunteer artists who arrived, unprompted, the morning after Karen's outburst to help Jenna restore it. Matteo returned, his face serious but warm, and without saying much began cleaning the gray streaks with a solvent-soaked cloth. Jenna worked beside him, each stroke of the sponge cutting through the dried film of spite, revealing the yellow dress beneath like a reclamation of joy. Karen hadn't been seen since the street cleanup. Her curtains remained closed. Her car stayed parked. No dog walks, no surveillance from her porch. It was as though the neighborhood itself had turned its gaze inward, no longer willing to be a part of the passive approval she had relied on. Jenna didn't gloat. She didn't theorize or speculate. She simply continued forward, returning to her work, keeping Lily engaged in small creative projects and maintaining the structure she had built from instinct and necessity. The mural was repaired within 48 hours, and when it was finished, a new detail had been added. At the base of the figure's dress, nestled among the butterflies, was a small chalk outline of a girl holding a piece of white pastel in one hand and shielding her eyes with the other, as if looking toward something not yet visible. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It was Lily, and it was Jenna's quiet acknowledgement that all of this, the persistence, the fight, the restraint, had never been about ego or proving a point. It had been about protecting that small hand from being taught to fear expression. The city confirmed shortly after that they would extend the mural's protected status indefinitely, pending no formal violations or safety concerns. The letter, while dry in tone, signaled more than legal permission. It was civic recognition that what Jenna had created, what she had defended, had value. Not just artistic value, but human value. It had become a marker, a place where people paused. Jenna noticed new foot traffic in the alley, particularly in the early evenings. People coming home from work, teenagers walking the long way around, even a woman who returned 3 days in a row with a sketchbook, quietly drawing beneath the painted figure's shadow. No one defaced it. No one scrawled over it. The wall, once a battleground, had become a meeting point of quiet reverence. Jenna didn't expect reconciliation. Karen was not the kind of person to apologize, and even if she had been, some things weren't meant to be patched with words. But there was one final moment, unexpected, fleeting, that brought a strange kind of closure. A week after the mural was restored, Jenna opened her mailbox to find a small, unmarked envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. On it, a single sentence was typed in a thin serif font. "I once had a sister who painted things too." There was no name, no return address. But Jenna didn't need one. The weight of it wasn't in the identity of the sender, but in the admission itself. Not forgiveness, not guilt, just a crack in the armor. She kept the note, tucked it into the same binder where she had collected months of threats, insults, and warnings. It belonged there, proof that even cruelty has a root, and that sometimes a mural is not a statement, but a mirror. Summer began to wane. The days grew shorter, the air crisp at night,